Hello all, this is Thursday's April 2nd's narrated PowerPoint. So we're going to start moving into the sections of your Persuasive Lit Review, the main paper for this class. If you've noticed the notes in the week's agenda, I have said that I have I've canceled that proposal section. We can move faster through the Persuasive Lit Review and spend more time on different sections with this online media. So, all right, so today we're going to talk about the overall literature review structure, and then particularly look at the background section. And I'll have you submit at least one draft paragraph of your background section by next Tuesday at 11:59. This will allow me to give you some feedback on that section. It tends to be the easiest section to write, and so let's just get started and look at how this fits into the overall structure. We'll also look at the what we'll be doing in week 11. So where do background paragraphs fit in? When you think of the background section, think of it as an extended part of your introduction. So you have that first part of the introduction that is that sets up, gets your reader into the paper, gives them a little bit of information, but primarily serves as a roadmap for the entire structure of the paper. So that's the important key of the thesis. The thesis can be one sentence, it could be multiple sentences, but it really provides that overview of that entire paper, including, because this is a persuasive literature review, your stance, some kind of inclination as to where your argument is going. So I always do my intro with the actual thesis last, so I'll teach this method. You have an idea, you have an overriding question or questions you're trying to answer through your review of the literature. Everyone is trying to get a current understanding of our knowledge at this point in time of their topic, and then convey that perspective and what the research is saying to the community of clinicians, researchers, patients, or whoever the stakeholder of that research could be. So don't even think about really your intro yet. Sometimes things from your background get re-diverted to that, but we will worry about that as the very last thing to create. Of course, you have a cover page, and you've been working on this. All the small assignments will include a cover page, so you should have this mastered by this point. And then you have, after your intro, you have this background section, and again, this is any information that your reader would need to know to follow the research you're going to present. This could be definitions, this could be stats on the propensity for the problem. It could be a description of methods. In many papers, like research papers, you include a literature review in this section, but since this is an entire literature review, that we won't have anything like that in there. Now, what's also key is that you'll want to have a transition once you've completed this, a transition into the body of your paragraph, of your paper. So we'll really work on what does that transition look like. So after you've introduced your topic, you've given your reader a thesis, a nice guideline, roadmap of where this paper is going. You've provided multiple paragraphs that provide background on your topic. And then you will have a transition into the body, getting them back into the research. And as you're organizing your findings, your many research articles, you'll want to look for patterns. And this is what we'll be looking at in week 11, is how to organize those sections of multiple sources and have them in conversation with each other, and doing some critical analysis of that literature. So keep that in mind, and we'll concentrate on that during week 11. Of course, then you have your multi-paragraph discussion conclusion section, which takes your reader into, gives them a brief summary of the most important findings you have, the most significant research that you think you can make some recommendations from. This could be recommendations for clinicians, for patients, for society as a whole. This also is a section that you might point out questions that have not been answered in the literature that you've reviewed so far, so gaps where research needs to continue. And then you might want to include a bigger section on how this research, how this topic fits in to the greater society or your field. So this is really bringing all things together, discussing gaps, providing application to one or more populations, and then societal implications. And this is where you do your work of making your final stance of what you think this research means. And of course, then you have your references in APA format, and then you have appendices if needed. So if there were images or diagrams or stuff that you didn't feel was needed in the body of the paper, but you want to include them in the appendices, then you can do so. So what to include in your background? Common things to cover is just in order to contextualize this research for your readers. In some cases, a historical context is needed. I would say that would fit in our discussion of this connection between MMR and autism. A little bit of history there would be good to show the initial research, the falsification of that research, the retraction of that article, and those kind of things before you got into the actual body of current research on vaccinations and autism, say, if that were your topic. Again, we won't be doing a literature review here, but often the background serves as a mini lit review. Any definitions, so even defining your, if you're working on an illness, defining what that illness is, citing the symptoms for diagnosis from, say, the DSM-5, that would be good. Any kind of processes that, if you're looking at current interventions on a problem, defining what those processes are, and giving the reader an understanding of what those interventions look like. This is a place where sometimes images are really helpful, particularly if you're dealing with the physical therapy sciences or some kind of medical interventions where diagrams of anatomy, diagrams of images of actual intervention procedures could be really helpful, and you can include those in your document. We'll look at how to do that, how to cite, put the figures in, put the images in, and then cite them correctly. So think about that as well. Sometimes we define the genre of whatever we're working on. Sometimes biography is needed if there are key players that have been involved in the process. That could go here. So if we just look at a minute at some examples, here we have a background paragraph from a history paper. Notice how they have a sort of a contextualization of what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is, in that you have immediately people, Martin Luther King Jr., and then later in the paragraph you have Malcolm X. They give a brief summary of what the Civil Rights Act meant and what it included. You have some data from Martin Luther King cited from an interview from Playboy. And then you have a little bit of interpretation, but notice the very last sentence, you have a transition that gets you back into the actual body of the paper. So you see those facts in there about numbers of demonstrators, and then you have King's claim that he is that he is responsible for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is also indirectly supported by Malcolm X in Message to the Grassroots, semicolon. There, X attacks King for being too close to the white power structure, specifically to John F. Kennedy. Although King and X regard the connections differently, both examples support King's nonviolent movements undeniably linked to the passage of the Civil Rights. So that kind of sentence serves as a transition, and now we can look at the analysis that shows that both of these men are responsible for the Civil Rights Act. So you have that sort of nice transition. This is a single paragraph background. Most of you will have more than that. If we look at this next paragraph, and I won't read all of this, very much a scientific article, but in the background, notice they're giving us a nice definition of microRNAs, explaining what those are in terms of RNA, DNA, and genetics. They give us an understanding of how these function in the body, and then very scientific, very using data from other people. Of course, this you're not the expert, you haven't done the research, so this will be heavily cited, a heavily cited section. Then notice that the last sentence says, along with cis-regulatory elements, miRNAs represent a large percentage of the highly important gene-regulating network. It is this network that many scientists now argue is responsible for the majority of the morphological complexity, and many point to miRNAs as the key player in the process of gene regulation. So the history of this that might need to be included here is that RNAs were considered junk material, not needed, and of course research has proved that wrong. And so this paper is going to review that literature that discusses how we do know that they have function in the body, and we'll look at those different functions. Here's another medical background paragraph, more on the medicine side. So here we are talking about glioblastoma multiforme tumors. So the first sentence introduces that. Notice the language here, they're stubborn, but the writer feels the need to rephrase that in a parenthetical, because stubborn here has a particular jargon meaning, and they want to make sure that we're not talking about we're not using it in a more heuristic or common day way. So they rephrase it in their own language to show that it has a special medical definition. They are aggressive, and again, the author feels the necessary to redefine that for the reader in the context of a medical setting. And then we have some stats. So of the different breeds of brain tumors, glioblastoma is the deadliest, with only 3% of patients surviving more than 3 years. So here, if you ask yourself, well, why that piece of information now? The author is really trying to set up the import of this research. And so we have some citations, some of which might not be that important. I find this next statement, what makes these tumors so tricky to treat is described in the name multiforme, coined by Cushing in 1926. That for there is supposed to be a AMA and note marker. That's where you get some of those in there. This was done in AMA format. It's pronounced multiforme. It's got the little E at the end. I think this is a little overkill and not needed, but definitely the notion that it has multiforms is important. Multiforme means multiple forms, of course. Metastases, tumors of the body that spread to the brain, ripen like peaches with a contain pit of cancerous cells encased by fleshy rings. Now, notice that the writer is really putting this jargon terminology into the hands of even an audience who may not be medically trained. So you have to ask yourself why things like these parentheticals that redefine jargon terms, why an image like a peach is used here. And so the audience, it can be assumed is not the medical community, and they're trying to mediate this language to the average reader. This is something I will have you do in the last paper. But it's good to note these kind of things. Now, it may be good that this is still for an academic audience, maybe just not surgeons. So we also have in this paragraph the diagnostic measures. On an MRI or CAT scan, the tumor may look like one big clump, but microscopically, the cells of malignancy fan out several inches beyond the central pit. Neither surgery nor radiation nor chemotherapy can remove all the tiny projections without also hurting the brain, which makes glioblastoma multiforme essentially incurable. So here the writer has done this nice job of setting up the problem. Why look at the research that's related to this type of tumor? And of course, it's simply because the complexity of this tumor is not treatable. So this is a really nice background paragraph, particularly when the audience members are not specialists. So this background section continues. It's has multi-paragraphs, and I would encourage you to also do this. Notice they're not long paragraphs, but they do build a nice context for the reader. So here again, we get a little more information about this kind of tumor, why it's in the brain, a little bit about how it interacts with the brain tissues and other tissues. So a little bit of its architecture. And notice the last sentence, the tumor tissue curdles and chars while the black, like the grizzled fat on a half-eaten steak. So they're giving very much visual imagery for this non-specialist audience. Again, in a third paragraph in this section, snaking between folds of brain, glioblastoma multiforme grows inconspicuously. By the time it's diagnosed, it's been cooking for a while. Art Ballinger, autopsy technician of the Yale School of Medicine, explains, hidden by scalp and skull, brain tumors aren't the reason patients seek medical care. Instead, something else is askew. Parents present with headaches, seizures, or symptoms traceable to the damaged brain region. Motor center tumors mean motor problems, speech problems, visual center blindness. So they're giving us a nice summary of the symptoms, and again, written for an audience that are not specialists. If this were an article written for surgeons or neurologists, of course, you could use the very specialized language of the DSM-5 or other kinds of medical research on this kind of tumor. So second background paragraph, research has only begun to consider ways in which adverse effects of stereotype threat can be alleviated. Rydell and Bauscher, 2010, for example, have demonstrated that identification with a positive self-identity could mask the threat generated by a negative one. In their study, female participants experienced both negative and positive self-relevant stereotypes about math performance through priming. That there is a term that possibly could be defined in this section, of their social identities as women and as college students, respectively. Performance on a subsequent math test was then shown to be optimal when participants could identify with the positive self-identity as opposed to the negative one. And so now we're getting more context about what this literature review will be about. This next one is from an educational paper. So it's quite long. It gives you a lot of information. You can see that the medical ones tend to be very concise, very much short paragraphs to the point. But if you read through this one, you will see that just to compare different disciplines, this one takes a lot more words. It has a lot more narrative, a lot more prose. And I want to just include this example, and I'll just scan through these, and you can read these at your own leisure, to show you how these formats different by discipline. So this one is multi-paragraph. And so because of the field that all of you are choosing, the fields that you're choosing, you want to go with concise, direct, to the point, which is actually easier to manage. We'll look at one more. So this is the political social analysis. So notice this writer has chosen to do a nice transition before explaining these issues. So we've got our thesis above this in the intro. And so the writer's letting the readers know we're going to do this bit of background information first. It would be instructive to explain the ideal yet realistically obtainable sort of society the majority of us envision. So of course this is more subjective work, more opinion, more philosophical. And so they're setting up the import of this. Notice this genre, this field does not have a lot of citations in this section. In contrast, your background paragraphs will be heavily cited. And so you can kind of look at this. But this is just to give you some examples. Plus, if you are in another class and have to write these kinds of papers, you can use these as examples of their background paragraphs. So, summary of the background. For you guys, short paragraphs, but multiple ones. I doubt any of you can get away with just a single background paragraph. Define and explain words, processes, back them up with research, but explain to the reader in crystal clear terms why this topic is important and what they need to know in order to read further. You may align with a theoretical perspective. Sometimes that comes up where you'll see that different theories are applied to the problem. You may have to state the stats here to show the pervasiveness of the problem. This tends to be a good place for multiple stats. You might use the general propensity of the problem in your intro, in that very first intro paragraph, but this would be more detailed stats, particularly if the problem affects, say, there's a sex difference between male and female, there's a age difference in different demographic populations, there's a socioeconomic issue, whatever it is, this is a place that you could do more detailed stats. You may include an overview of the cost, the human cost of this, and this is where I was talking about your use of pathos could come into your background. So one of your background paragraphs could present the scenario from a human perspective point of view, and so you could use anecdotal evidence, you could use case studies, but again, this is where it would be, and it would only be to show how this problem affects the daily lives of of the people who suffer from that problem. You could include a societal cost. How much is it costing us through through medical care, through individual person's finances, through other ways? How is this costing at the individual or societal level? And then key is this transition statement that signals to your reader that you're now getting into the body of that review of literature. And this may take a little bit of work and practice to do to get this transition statement. Okay, so what's due tonight? Tonight is your pop article comparison. So 11:59 p.m. Upload that to the Blackboard site, and then as we're looking ahead, now I had you do some research for your background back in week 6 before we went on spring break. So you should be in pretty good shape to do at least one background paragraph, if not more of your background paragraphs, and upload those by Tuesday 4/7 to the Blackboard site, so I can give you some feedback on those. Looking ahead to week 11, we'll do another PowerPoint, sort of like this, narrated PowerPoint on body paragraphs. And then we'll look at transitioning within paragraphs, between paragraphs. And then I'm kind of trying to stage this out a little bit easier for you so that you can concentrate on one thing per week. So then the following week, week 12, just like kind of following the same pattern on that Tuesday, I would ask to have to see at least one of your sample body paragraphs, so you can kind of plan ahead for 4/14 that sample background paragraph, then sample body paragraph, and as we move forward, we'll continue this process to make it a little bit more manageable. Okay, so that is all for this week, and so if you have any questions, I'll be doing the Zoom, or you can send me an email, but don't hesitate to do that during this time. All right, I hope you're all doing well. I really prefer to do this so I can stop and we can discuss, and you can add your comments and your experiences writing and reading, but we're just going to make this work for now.